That's the brief. Pedagogy, discourse, and identity. Okay, we did talk last time when we met that we might try and share a common transcript. Be a little more overlap between our three presentations. But I think what we need from our transcripts are different things if we're taking different kinds of perspectives, so we didn't quite manage that, unfortunately. I'm going to talk briefly, very briefly, about the linguistic terms of the mid-20th century, social term you might call it, just as a kind of setting the scene, setting the context. That's something we could return to at a later stage if we want to. I've got some hyperlink to some other slides. I then want to talk about the regulatory effects of discourses in terms of power and control. As I said in my notes that I'd be referring to Bernstein's work, so I will do. And then, again, as I suggested in my notes, I want to look at the notion of identity that comes out in Bernstein's work, but perhaps isn't adequate for kinds of classroom work, for classrooms, and so needs some kind of extension of that. Also, just briefly. Okay, so starting with the linguistic term, I've referring here to Wittgenstein. I suppose one could take other philosophers of the 20th century, but I think Wittgenstein is probably the key person that pushed 20th century thought in the direction of language and social practices as the sources of meaning. I've just got kind of summaries here of some of the ideas that have come from Wittgenstein. Obviously, the notion of use, something that people repeat often, that signs are somehow empty without use, so use gives life to signs. He talks about just what we mean by the term understanding. He gives a really nice example of how we might, what we would mean by saying I understand the word perhaps. But he's not looking just for rule following, he's also looking for going beyond. That of course is very relevant to us in teaching in general and teaching mathematics in particular. He kind of tries to unpack this notion that somehow we've got an assumption that understanding is deeper than just what it is that we actually do. He tries to demonstrate that's not the case, and perhaps the problem is that we talk about understanding as a mental process, and that's what leads us down the wrong path. I won't, as I say, take that any further, but there is a link, and we can look at some of Wittgenstein's ideas if anybody wants to talk about those later. I think what one would have to say is that Wittgenstein's ideas sort of beg the question of multiple roles of language, multiple language games, issues of power, issues of competing language games, overlapping language games. But I suppose you could say that unless we had that turn to language, the linguistic term, then we wouldn't have any way of engaging with issues of identity in these kinds of ways, and therefore moving on to issues of power. So I'll do that straight away and go on to issues of power and control, and as the pedagogic effects, in general the effects of discourses, but in the things we're interested in relation to teaching and learning. I suppose you could say that essentially what it's about is boundaries. It's about identifying boundaries, getting a notion of permeability or lack of permeability of boundaries, traversability of boundaries or not. And of course a lot of Bernstein's work is about the effects on students from different social groups, having different effects on students from different social groups. Bernstein talks about power as being realized in classification, which is the boundaries between, for example, the school subjects, the strength of the boundaries between mathematics and physics, mathematics and science and English and design and technology and everything else. He talks about there being two kinds of classification in schools. The integrated code is where we try and take themes that cut across different subjects, or collection code, the one that we're most familiar with. Mathematics has its own place in the timetable, its own teachers, its own sets of rules. Control is realized in framing, which is what goes on in the classroom. in terms of the relationship between teacher and students' texts and students' texts, and so on, where the authority is. And in particular, an issue there is distinguishing between localized and specialized. I think that's familiar to you, but I'll come back to that in just a moment. The issue of boundaries, I think, is sometimes fuzzy as to whether it's classification or it's framing. Let me give you an example from a project I'm involved in at the moment with Lerman, where we've been working with a group of teachers, designing some mathematical activities of the kind of problem-solving type that we're all very familiar with, and then videoing them and talking with the teachers about what's happened afterwards, and it's an ongoing process at the moment. This is one of the activities that the teachers chose to use. I need to read it. There is a second screen. Okay. Now, two teachers in our study used this in a nice presentation, as if this is actually a company making this proposal to the class of pupils. Both teachers were fairly horrified at what actually happened, because the students spent all their time designing their boxes, thinking of good slogans, colouring them in, making them original, making some fascinating shapes. One of them had a sort of cone shape, but it had a hole in the bottom, a cone-shaped hole, so that you could actually stack the boxes. The issue of volumes or of the card and the wastage of the card or anything just didn't occur at all. And no matter what kind of strategies the teachers used, one of them being, for example, 120 cubic centimeters. If you think of the possible three numbers that will multiply together to get you 120, that's a pretty tiny box. That was, hoping to provoke the pupils into thinking about issues of volumes and so on, but it didn't. Now that's something about the boundaries, right? This design technology has taken over, in fact, and what they're supposed to do in the classroom didn't worry the pupils at all. They just went ahead and did what it is that they were interested in. But the teachers themselves came to realize that there is a problem of making pupils recognize that these kinds of contexts, pseudo-contexts, are just that, and what you're supposed to do with them is something else.